643,000 tons of high explosives. That is roughly 1.2 billion pounds of ordnance, dropped systematically over a piece of land, roughly the size of the state of Florida. To put that into perspective, the United States Army Air Forces dropped a little over 500,000 tons of bombs in the entire Pacific theater during all of World War II. We dropped more explosive yield on a strip of Southeast Asian jungle than we did dismantling the entire Japanese Empire. Yet, this monumental display of industrial might, known as Operation Rolling Thunder, is widely studied today not as a masterclass in aerial dominance, but as one of the most profound strategic failures in modern military history. How does the greatest aerospace power on the planet drop that much steel and fire, and completely fail to break the will of a developing nation? Welcome back to the channel, where we dissect the tactics, the logistics, and the harsh realities of modern warfare. If you want to understand the grim mechanics of how wars are actually fought and lost, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments below if you think air power alone has ever truly won a war. To understand the colossal miscalculation of rolling thunder, we have to look past the jungles of Vietnam and step into the air-conditioned corridors of the Pentagon in the early 1960s. The United States military was suffering from a massive doctrinal hangover. Coming out of World War II, the newly formed United States Air Force was dominated by the bomber mafia. These were men who worshipped at the altar of strategic bombing, fully believing that fleets of B-29 superfortresses had brought Japan to its knees, and that the new B-52 Stratofortress could single-handedly win any future conflict. The prevailing theory was simple. If you destroy a nation's industrial capacity, you destroy its ability to wage war. But the men running the Department of Defense under President Lyndon B. Johnson were not seasoned combat commanders. They were the whiz kids led by Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. McNamara was a former executive at the Ford Motor Company, a man who believed war could be quantified, managed, and controlled on a spreadsheet. McNamara and his civilian analysts developed a doctrine known as graduated pressure. They viewed military force not as a hammer to crush the enemy, but as a thermostat. You turn the heat up just enough to cause pain, forcing the enemy to the negotiating table, and if they refuse, you turn the dial up a little more. It was a sterile, academic approach to human slaughter. Has a spreadsheet ever won a war against an enemy defending their own backyard? The answer is written in blood across military history. We had already learned this lesson in World War II during Operation Point Blank. In the fall of 1943, American bombers targeted the German ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, taking catastrophic losses under the assumption that cutting off ball bearings would instantly halt Nazi tank and aircraft production. It did not. The Germans simply decentralized their manufacturing and bought parts from neutral Switzerland. We learned it again in the winter of 1951 during the Korean War with Operation Strangle. The Air Force bombed every bridge, rail yard, and road junction in North Korea to starve the Chinese army of supplies. It completely failed because the Chinese did not rely on diesel trains. They relied on hundreds of thousands of peasants carrying 100-pound A-frames on their backs, marching at night. We ignored these lessons. We assumed that North Vietnam, a primarily agrarian society, would instantly buckle if we threatened their meager power plants and bridges. The political context was equally flawed. The United States was heavily invested in the domino theory, the belief that if South Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow. After the Gulf of Tonkin incident in August 1964, where the destroyers USS Maddox and USS Turner Joy reported being attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats, President Johnson was handed a blank check by Congress. He needed to show strength, but he was absolutely terrified of provoking the Soviet Union or Communist China into a direct nuclear confrontation. He did not want a massive ground war in Asia, nor did he want to trigger World War III. So, a strategic bombing campaign seemed like the perfect political compromise. It was clean, it was American, and it kept the casualty numbers off the front pages, at least initially. But let us look at the actual forces that were about to clash in the skies over Southeast Asia, because the mismatch between doctrine and reality was staggering. On the American side, you had a Goliath built for a completely different kind of war. The primary workhorse for the Air Force during the early days of Rolling Thunder was the Republic F-105 Thunderchief, affectionately and sometimes bitterly known as the Thud. The Thud was a 50,000-pound behemoth of a fighter bomber. It was powered by a massive Pratt & Whitney J75 turbojet engine, pushing 24,000 pounds of thrust. But the F-105 was not designed to dogfight over the jungle. It was designed to carry a single tactical nuclear weapon in an internal bomb bay, fly at Mach 2 on the deck across the plains of Europe, drop the nuke on a Soviet tank column, and outrun the blast wave. Now, this supersonic nuclear dart was being forced to bolt heavily dragged iron bombs to its wings, destroying its aerodynamic profile, and fly into the most heavily defended airspace in the world. Alongside the Thud was the McDonnell F-4 Phantom II, utilized by both the Air Force and the Navy, flying off carriers at Yankee Station in the Gulf of Tonkin. The Phantom's a masterpiece of brute force aerodynamics, proving that with enough thrust, you can make a brick fly. But it suffered from a fatal design flaw, born of Pentagon arrogance. The designers believed the era of the dogfight was over, so they did not give the Phantom an internal cannon. Instead, it relied entirely on air-to-air missiles, primarily the AIM-7 Sparrow. The Sparrow was a radar-guided missile designed to shoot down heavy, non-maneuvering Soviet Tu-95 Bear bombers in the freezing, thin air over the Arctic. When you took those early vacuum tube electronics, slammed them onto the deck of an aircraft carrier, exposed them to 100-degree heat and 90% jungle humidity, and fired them at a violently maneuvering fighter jet, the failure rate was catastrophic. Nearly 90% of early Sparrow missiles either failed to track, failed to detonate, or simply dropped straight into the ocean off the launch rail. Facing this armada was the Vietnam People's Air Force, and the narrative that America was fighting a bunch of simple farmers in black pajamas is a dangerous myth. The North Vietnamese, heavily backed by the Soviet Union and China, had constructed the most dense, lethal, and integrated air defense system the world had ever seen. The centerpiece of this lethal web was the Soviet A-2 guideline surface-to-air missile. The SA-2 was a 35-foot-long flying telephone pole, accelerating to Mach 3.5 and carrying a 430-pound fragmentation warhead. It was guided by the Fan Song radar system, which could track American strike packages from hundreds of miles away. But the SAMs were only one layer of the trap. The North Vietnamese deployed thousands of anti-aircraft artillery pieces, ranging from rapid-fire 14.5mm machine guns up to massive 85mm and 100mm radar-guided flak cannons. This created a deadly tactical dilemma for American pilots. If you fly high above 10,000 feet to avoid the storm of anti-aircraft fire, the SA-2 radars will paint you, and a missile will blow you out of the sky. If you dive down to the deck to evade the SAMs, you fly right into a wall of thousands of tracer rounds from the AAA batteries. It was a meat grinder designed to strip away the technological advantages of the American jets. And then there were the MiGs. The North Vietnamese flew the Soviet-built MiG-17 and later the MiG-21. By American standards, the MiG-17 was obsolete. It was subsonic, it had no radar, and it lacked sophisticated missiles. But it was incredibly light, brutally simple, and armed with 3 devastating cannons, 2 23mm and 1 heavy 37mm. In a tight turning fight in the dense air at low altitude, the MiG-17 could easily out-turn a heavy bomb-laden F-105 or an F-4 Phantom. Furthermore, the North Vietnamese did not fight fair. They utilized ground-controlled interception, or GCI. Soviet-trained radar operators on the ground tracked the incoming American strike packages, which were flying predictable routes at predictable times. The controllers would guide the MiGs to wait in ambush, vectoring them directly into the blind spots of the American formations. The MiGs would slash through the formation, force the Americans to drop their bombs early in order to defend themselves, and then dive away into the clouds before the Phantoms could get a missile lock. The most glaring absurdity of this entire force comparison, however, was the industrial asymmetry. The American doctrine of strategic bombing relied on destroying the enemy's war-making industry. But North Vietnam did not have a war-making industry to bomb. Their tanks, their missiles, their ammunition, and their fighter jets were not being built in Hanoi. They were being built thousands of miles away in the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union and the industrial hubs of Manchuria in China. We were sending multi-million-dollar aircraft, flown by highly trained officers, to bomb bicycle repair shops, thatched roof barracks, and wooden bridges that the North Vietnamese simply rebuilt overnight. Worse still was the micromanagement from Washington. President Johnson and Secretary McNamara instituted the infamous Tuesday lunch meetings. Every week, they would sit around a table in the White House, Look at aerial reconnaissance photos and personally select the targets for the upcoming week. The military commanders in the Pacific were entirely bypassed. Johnson, terrified of hitting a Soviet supply ship or a Chinese advisor, placed massive restricted zones around the enemy's most vital areas. There was a 30-mile no-bomb radius around the capital of Hanoi and a 10-mile restricted zone around the main port city of Haiphong. The North Vietnamese quickly realized this. They simply parked their SA-2 missile batteries, their fuel dumps, and their MiG airfields right inside these restricted sanctuaries. American pilots were forced to fly over enemy air bases, watching MiGs taxi on the runway, and were strictly forbidden from dropping a bomb on them because the White House had not explicitly approved that specific patch of concrete. We had built the most powerful technologically advanced air armada in human history, armed it with weapons designed for a nuclear apocalypse, and handed the controls over to politicians who were trying to send diplomatic signals through high explosives. The stage was set for a collision between bureaucratic theory and the brutal, unforgiving reality of combat. On March 2nd, 1965, the order finally came down, the waiting was over, and the first massive strike packages of F-105 Thunderchiefs roared off the runways in Thailand, heavily laden with ordnance, turning their noses north toward the dense green canopy of enemy territory. As those F-105s crossed the coastline and pushed into North Vietnamese airspace, the theoretical war of Washington's spreadsheets instantly evaporated into the terrifying reality of combat. The initial strikes of Operation Rolling Thunder targeted ammunition depots and barracks just north of the demilitarized zone. But the operational tempo quickly escalated, forcing American aviators into a daily grind of survival against an enemy that adapted faster than the Pentagon could comprehend. The sheer logistical footprint required just to put a single bomb on a target in the north was a staggering marvel of American engineering. Fighter bombers launching from Takli and Korat Royal Thai Air Force bases simply could not carry a full combat load of heavy iron bombs and still hold enough internal fuel to make the round trip. They relied entirely on a massive, continuous airborne gas station over Laos and the Gulf of Tonkin, utilizing fleets of Boeing KC-135 Stratotankers. Imagine flying a heavily loaded jet fighter at 300 miles per hour, 30,000 feet in the air, and having to precisely guide a boom receptacle into a flying fuel pipe, often in complete radio silence and blinding monsoon weather, just to ensure you had enough gas to reach the target and fight your way home. It was an exhausting, high-stakes ballet before the shooting even started. Once the strike packages entered the threat rings of the Red River Delta, they were painted by Soviet-supplied spoon rest and flat-face early warning radars. By the time the Americans reached their targets, the sky was already black with flak. Have we ever seen a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire like this before in American military history? You have to go back to the skies over Germany in 1943, when the 8th Air Force flew unescorted daylight bombing raids over the Ruhr Valley, known to bomber crews as Happy Valley. Just like the B-17 flying fortresses over Schweinfurt, the F-115s over North Vietnam were flying into a predetermined kill zone, but instead of just facing 88mm flak cannons, they were facing Mach 3 radar-guided missiles. The SA-2 guideline missile completely dictated the tactical geometry of the air war. When the Fan Song radar locked onto an American jet, the pilot had only seconds to react. The standard evasion tactic, known as the SAM break, required nerves of absolute steel. The pilot had to visually acquire the missile, which looked like a flying telephone pole riding a pillar of white fire, wait until it was about a mile away, and then violently jam the control stick forward, pulling negative Gs to dive before snapping into a massive, high G barrel roll. This maneuver was designed to bleed the missile's kinetic energy and break the radar lock, but it came with a fatal consequence. Diving to evade the SAM forced the American jets right down into the lethal envelope of thousands of radar-guided 37mm, 57mm, and 85mm anti-aircraft artillery pieces waiting on the ground. To counter this deadly layered defense, the United States Air Force had to invent an entirely new combat discipline on the fly, giving birth to the wild weasels. The concept was as brilliant as it was suicidal. The motto was simple: first in, last out. We took two-seat F-100F Super Sabres, and later the heavier F-105G models, and packed them with classified radar homing and warning receivers. The back-seater, the electronic warfare officer, or BEAR, would listen to the electronic emissions of the enemy radar sites. The wild weasels would deliberately fly ahead of the main strike package, acting as bait to force the North Vietnamese SAM operators to turn their radars on. Once the Fan Song radar emitted a signal, the weasel pilot would fire an AGM-45 Shrike anti-radiation missile. The Shrike was designed to ride the enemy radar beam all the way down to the transmitter and destroy it. It was a terrifying game of high-speed electronic cat and mouse. If the Soviet-trained operators on the ground realized a Shrike was inbound, they would abruptly shut off their radar. The missile, losing its guidance beam, would go ballistic and miss, allowing the SAM site to reposition and ambush the next flight. The physical environment of North Vietnam was just as hostile as the air defenses. The geography surrounding Hanoi is dominated by jagged limestone, karst formations, the most famous being the Tam Dao Range, universally known to American pilots as Thud Ridge. This massive spine of rock pointed like an arrow directly toward the enemy capital. American pilots used Thud Ridge to mask their radar signatures from the SAM sites, flying dangerously low through the valleys. But the real enemy was the weather. The northeast monsoon dominates Southeast Asia from October to March, blanketing the region in a solid, impenetrable deck of clouds from the jungle floor all the way up to 10,000 feet. You cannot bomb a bridge or a rail yard you cannot see, especially when relying on unguided Mark 82 500-pound and Mark 84 2,000-pound iron bombs. The rules of engagement dictated by Washington required visual identification of targets to prevent civilian casualties, meaning that for half the year, The multi-million-dollar American air armada was essentially grounded or forced to drop bombs blindly, using inaccurate radar bombing techniques, hitting nothing but mud and jungle canopy. To truly understand the tactical ingenuity forced upon American combat commanders by a failed strategic doctrine, we must examine Operation Bolo. By late 1966, the MiG-21 threat had become intolerable. The North Vietnamese fighters were utilizing hit-and-run tactics, directed by ground control interception. They would wait in ambush, slash through the bomb-laden F-105 formations, force them to jettison their ordnance early, and dive back to their heavily defended airfields. Washington strictly forbade American pilots from bombing the MiG airbases, fearing that a stray bomb might kill a Soviet technician and trigger a global war. So, how do you destroy an enemy air force when you are not allowed to bomb their runways? You trick them into coming up to fight on your terms. Enter Colonel Robin Olds, commander of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, the Wolf Pack, based at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base. Olds was not a Pentagon bureaucrat in a tailored suit. He was a West Point graduate, a former All-American defensive tackle, and a World War II double ace who had downed 24 German aircraft flying P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs. He understood the brutal, unforgiving geometry of aerial combat better than anyone in the theatre. Olds and his tacticians devised a masterclass in aerial deception. They planned to equip F-4 Phantom II fighters with QRC-160 radar jamming pods, a piece of electronic warfare equipment normally only carried by the F-105 Thunderchiefs. The Phantoms would fly the exact same ingress routes, at the exact same altitudes, at the exact same speeds, and use the exact same radio call signs and vernacular as a standard F-105 bombing mission. The North Vietnamese radar operators would look at their scopes and see what they thought was a slow, heavy, vulnerable group of bomb-laden Thunderchiefs. This level of tactical deception perfectly mirrors Operation Fortitude during World War II, where the Allies used inflatable tanks and fake radio traffic to convince the German High Command that the D-Day invasion would land at Pas-de-Calais instead of Normandy. In both cases, the enemy's absolute reliance on their own intelligence-gathering systems was weaponized against them. On January 2, 1967, the trap was sprung. The weather over the Red River Delta was terrible, with a solid undercast of clouds at 7,000 feet. Colonel Olds led the first flight, callsign Olds Flight, directly into the target area over Phuoc Yen Air Base. The North Vietnamese took the bait hook, line and sinker. The ground controllers scrambled the MiG-21s, expecting an easy slaughter. The MiGs punched up through the dense cloud deck, looking for sluggish F-105s. Instead, they found Robin Olds and a swarm of F-4 Phantoms configured purely for air-to-air combat, armed to the teeth with AIM-7 Sparrow and AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles. The engagement was violent and decisive. The Phantom relied on its massive J-79 engines to maintain energy, pulling high-G barrel rolls and slicing across the sky to get behind the highly maneuverable MiGs. The AM-9B Sidewinder was a primitive, heat-seeking missile that required the American pilot to pull lead, get directly behind the enemy's tailpipe, and wait to hear the specific growl of the seeker head, acquiring the hot exhaust before pulling the trigger. In a frenetic 12-minute furball, the Wolfpack decimated the enemy. They shot down 7 MiG-21s, nearly half of the entire North Vietnamese MiG-21 inventory at the time, without losing a single American aircraft. It was a staggering tactical triumph, proving the unmatched skill and lethality of the American fighter pilot when untethered from bureaucratic micromanagement. Yet, for all the tactical brilliance displayed in operations like Bolo, the broader strategic bombing campaign was bleeding out in a futile effort to sever the enemy's logistical spine. The primary objective of Rolling Thunder was to stop the flow of men and materiel from North Vietnam to the Viet Cong in the south. This required interdicting the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Let us examine the sheer industrial absurdity of this effort. We were trying to destroy a 19th-century logistics network with 20th-century supersonic bombers. The trail was not a paved, multi-lane highway. It was a 12,000-mile labyrinth of dirt paths, hidden under triple canopy jungle, winding covertly through the neutral nations of Laos and Cambodia. We dropped millions of gallons of defoliants like Agent Orange just to kill the leaves so our pilots could see the dirt. We dropped thousands of acoustic and seismic sensors in Operation Igloo White, hoping to listen for the rumble of Soviet-built truck engines. But the enemy simply adapted. When the trucks were destroyed, they used bicycles reinforced with bamboo to carry hundreds of pounds of supplies. When the bridges were bombed, they built underwater pontoons that were invisible from the air. Consider the campaign against the Paul Duma Bridge, a massive, mile-long steel truss bridge spanning the Red River in Hanoi. It was the vital logistical artery connecting the port of Haiphong to the capital. Between 1965 and 1967, the United States flew hundreds of sorties against this single structure. Why is it so incredibly difficult to destroy a bridge? Because dropping an unguided Mark 84, 2,000-pound bomb from 15,000 feet at 500 miles per hour leaves a circular error probable of several hundred feet. You have to score a direct hit on a steel support beam only a few feet wide, while flying through a concentration of anti-aircraft fire that rivaled the defenses of Berlin in 1945. We lost dozens of aircraft and highly trained men trying to drop this one bridge, and every time we managed to damage a span, thousands of North Vietnamese laborers would swarm the structure at night and repair it with wooden planks and steel plates within days. The courage of the American aviators flying these missions was unquestionable. Their tactical adaptations were brilliant, and the sheer tonnage of high explosives dropped upon the earth was staggering. Yet, as 1967 bled into 1968, the smoking ruins of North Vietnamese bridges, the cratered dirt roads of Laos, and the twisted metal of downed MiGs did absolutely nothing to halt the relentless, grinding flow of men and materiel heading south. The American military machine was winning virtually every tactical engagement in the sky, dominating the airspace with unmatched technology and firepower, but on the ground, deep in the sweltering jungles of South Vietnam, the enemy was quietly and methodically massing their forces for a massive, coordinated offensive that would shatter the illusion of American progress and violently alter the trajectory of the entire war. The illusion of American progress, built on a mountain of manipulated statistics and bomb damage assessments, was violently shattered on January 31st, 1968, as the skies over North Vietnam continued to absorb hundreds of thousands of tons of high explosives. 80,000 North Vietnamese Army and Viet Cong troops launched the Tet Offensive, striking over 100 cities, towns, and military bases across South Vietnam simultaneously. This was the ultimate, undeniable proof of Rolling Thunder's strategic bankruptcy. The primary stated objective of the bombing campaign was to interdict the flow of men and materiel down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Yet, despite dropping more explosive yield than the entire Pacific campaign of World War II, the enemy had successfully moved massive quantities of AK-47, assault rifles, B-40 rocket-propelled grenades, heavy mortars, and thousands of regular infantrymen right under the noses of the greatest air armada on the planet. If you drop 643,000 tons of bombs to stop an enemy from moving, and they respond by launching the largest, most coordinated ground offensive of the entire war, what exactly did those bombs accomplish? To understand how such a colossal failure occurred, we must step away from the cockpit and look at the brutal mathematics of the war, specifically the cost-exchange ratio. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and his whiz kids worshipped data, but they were looking at the wrong spreadsheet. The American military was expending astronomical amounts of national treasure to destroy practically worthless infrastructure. A single Republic F-105 Thunderchiefs cost roughly $2.1 million in 1965, and a McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II cost even more. During the 3.5 years of Rolling Thunder, the United States lost over 900 aircraft to enemy action. The Central Intelligence Agency conducted a grim analysis of the campaign and concluded that for every $1 of damage inflicted upon the North Vietnamese infrastructure, the United States was spending $9.60. We were flying multi-million-dollar supersonic fighter jets, piloted by officers whose training cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, to drop $3,000 bombs on $10 bicycles and wooden bridges that were rebuilt by peasant laborers the very next day. This economic absurdity highlights the fundamental misunderstanding of the enemy's logistical network. The United States was attempting to wage an industrial war of attrition against a nation that had no industry to attrit it. North Vietnam was not producing its own surface-to-air missiles, radar systems, heavy artillery, or fighter jets. They were entirely subsidized by the Sino-Soviet bloc. The Soviet Union treated the skies over Hanoi as a massive live-fire testing ground for their air defense networks. shipping thousands of SA-2 guideline missiles and MiG fighters into the port of Haiphong. The Chinese, meanwhile, deployed over 300,000 engineering and anti-aircraft troops into North Vietnam to repair the bombed railways and man the flak batteries, because Washington was absolutely terrified of provoking a direct confrontation with Moscow or Beijing. American pilots were strictly forbidden from bombing the Soviet supply ships sitting in the harbor or the Chinese rail lines right on the border. We were trying to drain an ocean by scooping water out of the middle, while explicitly refusing to turn off the massive industrial faucets pouring into it. We can see a haunting parallel to this strategic hubris in the history of the American Revolution. In the late 18th century, the British Empire possessed the greatest navy on earth, the most disciplined line infantry, and the deepest treasury. They captured major cities like New York and Philadelphia, assuming that taking infrastructure would break the colonial rebellion. But General George Washington did not need to defeat the British military in a decisive stand-up battle. He utilized a Fabian strategy, a war of attrition designed to simply keep the Continental Army alive, bleeding the British forces through skirmishes and making the occupation so financially and politically costly that the government in London would eventually lose the will to fight. A century and a half later, Ho Chi Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giap applied the exact same strategic principle against the United States. They understood that the true center of gravity was not the concrete bridges of Hanoi, but the political patience of the American public. They willingly absorbed the terrifying punishment of rolling thunder, because they knew they could outbleed the political resolve of Washington. The institutional obsession with metrics over reality created a dangerous feedback loop of bad intelligence. The Pentagon relied heavily on bomb damage assessment, or BDA, to measure success. Reconnaissance aircraft like the RF-4C Phantom and the RF-101 Voodoo would fly over the target areas after a strike to photograph the destruction. If a photo showed a cratered road or a collapsed wooden structure, it was tallied as a victory. But a cratered dirt road in the jungle is not a destroyed ball-bearing factory in Germany. A dirt road can be filled in with gravel and packed earth in 3 hours by a local militia, armed with nothing but shovels and woven baskets. We were measuring the level of effort, counting the number of sorties flown and the tonnage of ordnance dropped, and falsely equating that effort with strategic effect. Can you truly win a war by simply counting the number of holes you punch in the dirt? To witness the ultimate symbol of this technological futility, we must examine the agonizing campaign against the Than Hoa Bridge, known to the Vietnamese as the Dragon's Jaw. This was a massive, heavily reinforced concrete and steel arch bridge spanning the Song Ma River. It was a critical choke point for trains and trucks heading south. Between 1965 and 1968, the United States military flew an astounding 871 sorties against this single structure. We hammered it with thousands of unguided Mark 82 and Mark 84 iron bombs, and even fired early AGM-12 bullpup radio-guided missiles at it. The bridge absorbed the punishment like a sponge. The unguided gravity bombs dropped from high altitude simply lacked the kinetic precision required to sever the massive concrete pillars. Hundreds of bombs landed in the river, and the few that struck the superstructure only caused superficial damage. In the desperate attempt to drop this one bridge, the United States lost 11 aircraft to the dense Jung's ring of anti-aircraft artillery surrounding the gorge. This specific failure at the Dragon's Jaw, however, forced a necessary and revolutionary evolution in military technology. The Air Force realized that dropping hundreds of dumb bombs to hit a single point target was a suicidal waste of men and machines. This realization directly birthed the development of precision-guided munitions. Engineers at Texas Instruments began developing the Paveway series of laser-guided bombs. By attaching a laser seeker head and maneuverable fins to a standard iron bomb, a pilot could illuminate a target with a laser beam, and the bomb would guide itself precisely onto the crosshairs. It would not be until 1972, during Operation Linebacker, that American F-4 Phantoms utilizing these new laser-guided bombs would finally drop the Dragon's Jaw in a single mission. Rolling Thunder was the bloody, costly laboratory that proved the era of unguided carpet bombing was coming to an end, paving the way for the smart weapons that dominate modern warfare today. The human cost of this campaign also forced a radical restructuring of how American fighter pilots were trained. The kill ratios over North Vietnam were deeply alarming to the top brass. During the Korean War, American F-86 Sabres enjoyed an estimated 10-to-1 kill ratio over Soviet-built MiG-15s. But in the skies over Hanoi, the overall kill ratio plummeted to barely 2-to-1, and during certain months it was an abysmal 1-to-1 parity. American pilots, relying on faulty Sparrow missiles and trained for long-range nuclear interception, had forgotten the brutal art of the dogfight. In 1968, the United States Navy commissioned the Alt Report to investigate these catastrophic failures. The findings were stark. The technology was failing, but more importantly, the training was completely inadequate for close-in aerial combat. This led directly to the creation of the United States Navy Strike Fighter Tactics Instructor Program, universally known today as Top Gun. The Navy pulled their best combat veterans, stripped away the reliance on long-range missiles, and ruthlessly drilled their pilots in the science of energy maneuverability theory and close quarters dogfighting against dissimilar aircraft. The Air Force soon followed suit, establishing Project Red Flag in the Nevada desert. Red Flag was designed to give rookie pilots their first 10 combat missions in a highly realistic, intensely stressful simulated environment, because statistics showed that if a pilot survived his first 10 missions, his chances of surviving the rest of his tour increased exponentially. We had to sacrifice hundreds of young men in the flak-filled skies of Southeast Asia just to remember how to properly train a fighter pilot. We see this tragic cycle of relying on technological supremacy to compensate for a flawed strategy repeated in recent history. Look at the global war on terror in places like Afghanistan. For 2 decades, the United States controlled the airspace with absolute, uncontested impunity. We spent trillions of dollars dropping highly advanced GPS-guided JDAMs and Hellfire missiles from MQ-9 Reaper drones onto mud brick compounds in the Hindu Kush, attempting to eradicate a decentralized, religiously motivated insurgency. Just like the Viet Cong, the Taliban did not have an industrial base to bomb. They relied on light infantry tactics, cross-border sanctuaries in Pakistan that were politically immune from major ground invasion, and the sheer patience to outlast the American political will. We dominated every single tactical engagement. We dropped precision ordnance with terrifying accuracy. Yet the fundamental flaw of trying to solve a complex, localized political problem purely through the application of overwhelming aerial firepower remained exactly the same. By the spring of 1968, the political reality finally crushed the bureaucratic fantasy. On March 31st, President Lyndon B. Johnson addressed the American public on national television. He was a broken man, his presidency destroyed by the psychological shock of the Tet Offensive, the mounting casualties, and the massive anti-war protests tearing American cities apart. In a stunning broadcast, he announced a unilateral halt to all bombing north of the 20th parallel, effectively terminating Operation Rolling Thunder. Minutes later, he shocked the world by declaring he would not seek, nor would he accept, the nomination of his party for another term as your president. The bombing campaign that the whiz kids promised would neatly, cleanly, and mathematically force a third-world nation to surrender, had instead forced the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military on Earth out of office. Operation Rolling Thunder stands as a monumental testament to the bravery of the aviators who flew into the most lethal air defense network in history, and a damning indictment of the politicians who sent them there. 643,000 tons of bombs could not break the will of a people who had nothing left to lose, because you cannot bomb a peasant society back into the Stone Age when they are perfectly willing to fight from the Stone Age to achieve their goals. Air power is a devastating, necessary component of combined arms warfare, but it is not a magic wand that can bypass the brutal, muddy reality of ground combat and political resolve. War is not a sterile spreadsheet, and the unyielding human spirit cannot be quantified, managed, or broken simply by increasing the explosive tonnage. Now, I want to hear your assessment of this historical failure. Which factor do you believe was the absolute primary reason Operation Rolling Thunder failed to achieve its strategic goals? Was it A, the absurd political micromanagement and restricted target zones dictated by the White House? Was it B, the massive, uninterrupted logistical support provided to North Vietnam by the Soviet Union and China? Or was it C, the fundamental flaw of trying to use strategic bombing against a decentralized agrarian society? Drop your answer and your reasoning in the comments below, and I will see you on the next battlefield.